Walter Hensley owned nearly 700 acres of Kansas farmland, 2 grain silos, and investments worth more money than most people in his county would earn in a lifetime. For decades, people pointed to Hensley Ridge Farm as proof that hard work still meant something. The wheat fields stretched to the horizon. The machinery was paid for. The books were clean. Walter's handshake was worth more than most contracts. But after his wife died, Walter noticed something that hurt more than grief itself. His children only called when they needed something. A loan, a signature. Advice about money. No one called simply to ask how he was surviving the silence. No one asked what it felt like to walk through a house that still smelled faintly like his wife. No one asked whether he was sleeping, or eating, or lonely. At first, Walter told himself he was imagining it. People had jobs, families, responsibilities. Then months passed. Nothing changed. So Walter made a decision that would either reveal the truth or destroy what remained of his family. He gave away his truck. He locked the farmhouse. He moved into a crumbling trailer on the edge of his property. Then he told his 4 children the same lie. The farm was gone. The money was gone. Everything he had spent 48 years building had disappeared. And then Walter waited to see who would still come when there was nothing left to inherit. Long before there was a Hensley Ridge farm, there was a 23-year-old man standing in a wheat field with dirt on his boots and more debt than common sense. Walter Hensley inherited 80 acres from his father in 1979. The land came with aging equipment, a leaking barn, and a bank loan that was already falling behind. Most people would have sold it. Walter stayed. That same summer, he married Margaret Foster. The wedding was small enough that everyone fit inside the fellowship hall of the local church. Margaret wore a simple white dress her mother had altered by hand. Walter borrowed money for the reception and spent the first year of marriage paying it back. Neither of them cared. They were young enough to believe hard work could solve almost anything. For a long time it did. The farmhouse they moved into leaned slightly to the east. Rain leaked through the roof. Wind slipped through gaps around the windows every winter. Walter repaired what he could. Margaret repaired the rest. When money was tight, she stretched every dollar until it seemed impossible. When machinery broke during harvest, she worked beside Walter until midnight. When drought hit, she sat across from him at the kitchen table and helped him figure out how to survive another season. Together, they slowly turned 80 acres into 160, then 300, then 500, eventually nearly 700. By the time their first child, Travis, was born, the farm had become stable. Vanessa arrived 2 years later. Ethan followed 3 years after that. Then, when Margaret thought their family was complete, Claire arrived as a surprise blessing neither parent had expected. Walter spent his life building fields, barns, silos, accounts, investments. Margaret spent hers holding people together. She remembered birthdays. She called the children every week. She knew when someone was struggling before they admitted it themselves. Walter loved his family deeply. The problem was that he rarely said it. He assumed they knew. If Travis needed help starting a business, Walter wrote a check. If Vanessa needed college tuition, Walter paid it. If Ethan's repair shop struggled, Walter stepped in. Providing became his language. Margaret understood something he did not. People needed more than support. They needed presence. For 48 years, she quietly translated Walter's love into something the children could feel. And then, one gray Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. The doctor entered the examination room, carrying test results. Margaret reached for Walter's hand before the doctor even spoke. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The words landed like a hammer. Walter remembered very little after that, only Margaret's fingers squeezing his hand. Only her calm voice asking what came next. Only the terrible realization that the one person who had always known how to hold the family together might soon be gone. And for the first time in nearly 50 years, Walter felt truly afraid. He had no idea that the hardest part of losing Margaret would not be her death. It would be discovering what remained after she was gone. Margaret fought for 9 months. Through chemotherapy, radiation, exhaustion, and pain, she remained the strongest person in every room she entered. Even when her body weakened, her habits never changed. She still reminded Walter to eat breakfast, still remembered birthdays, Still called Claire every Sunday evening. Still asked about Ethan's repair shop. Still worried whether Vanessa was working too much. Still found reasons to be proud of Travis. The cancer took her strength, but it never took her attention from the people she loved. Walter spent those months beside her. At first, he believed she would beat it. Margaret had always overcome every challenge life put in front of her. But cancer was different. By spring, the doctors had stopped talking about recovery and started talking about comfort. Walter hated that word. Comfort meant surrender. Margaret understood that before he did. One evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the wheat fields outside the hospital window, she reached for his hand. "You'll be okay," she told him. Walter shook his head. "No." A faint smile touched her lips. "You'll have to learn how." 3 months later, she died. The funeral filled the church. Farmers, neighbors, old friends, former teachers, business associates. People came from every corner of the county. Margaret had spent her life investing in people, and they came to honor that investment. Walter sat in the front pew beside his children and heard almost none of the service. Everything felt distant, muted, as though he were watching someone else's life. Afterward, standing in the church fellowship hall, he began noticing things he wished he hadn't. Travis spent 15 minutes discussing land values with a commercial developer from Wichita. Vanessa answered emails between conversations. Ethan quietly asked whether the life insurance claim had been filed. Only Claire stayed close. She found Walter standing alone beside the kitchen sink after the luncheon. Without saying a word, she took his hand. She stood beside him for nearly 10 minutes. No questions. No advice. No awkward attempts to fix grief. Just presence. Margaret had always known how to do that. Claire had learned from her. The months following the funeral were worse than the funeral itself. The house became unbearably quiet. Walter discovered that loneliness was not dramatic. It arrived in small moments. An empty chair at breakfast. 2 coffee mugs becoming 1. No voice answering from another room. No light under the bedroom door. No one reminding him to buy groceries. The children called, but something felt different now. Travis wanted to discuss market conditions. Vanessa called between meetings. Ethan needed help covering expenses at the repair shop. Claire called every Sunday, without fail. Sometimes she talked about her students, sometimes about Sadie and Noah, sometimes about nothing important at all. But she always ended the same way. "How are you doing, Dad?" Nobody else asked that question. Winter passed. Spring arrived. One afternoon in April, Walter finally began sorting through Margaret's belongings. The task felt impossible. Every drawer contained memories. Every closet held traces of a life shared for nearly 5 decades. Near the back of the bedroom closet, a small leather journal slipped from a shelf and landed at his feet. Walter stared at it for several seconds. He recognized it immediately. Margaret had written in it for years, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning before anyone else was awake. He picked it up carefully. The cover was worn smooth from use. For a long moment, he considered putting it away. Then he opened it. A random page fell open near the middle. Walter began reading. Within seconds, his entire understanding of his family began to change. The entry was dated 3 years before Margaret's diagnosis. Walter recognized her handwriting immediately. Neat, steady, patient. The handwriting of a woman who never rushed through anything important. He read the first sentence once. Then again. Then a third time. A man's children should come to see him because they want to, not because there's something to sign. Walter felt something tighten inside his chest. He continued reading. "I've been trying to explain this to Walter for years. He thinks providing and loving are the same thing. They aren't. The children have learned his language. They speak to him through transactions because that's the language he taught them." Walter lowered the journal. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Outside, wind moved through the wheat fields. Inside, the house seemed frozen in time. Margaret's reading glasses still sat beside her favorite chair. Her knitting basket remained tucked beside the fireplace. Her coffee mug still occupied its usual place in the cabinet. Everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of the life they had built together. And now, through words written years earlier, Margaret was showing him something he had spent decades refusing to see. Walter had always believed his responsibility was simple. Work hard, provide, protect. Everything else would take care of itself. Margaret had carried the emotional weight of the family. She remembered who needed encouragement, who needed comfort, who needed forgiveness, who needed a phone call. Walter had assumed the family would continue functioning after she was gone. Instead, it seemed to be quietly drifting apart. The realization followed him for days, then weeks. He found himself rereading the journal at night. Some entries described family vacations, others recorded ordinary moments. A birthday party, a school concert, a Thanksgiving dinner. But scattered throughout the pages were observations Margaret had made over the years. Walter never misses a payment, but sometimes he misses people. Or the children know their father would give them everything he owns. I'm not sure they know he'd give them his heart, too. Those words hurt more than grief, because they felt true. One morning in early June, Walter closed the journal and made a decision. 2 hours later, he walked into the law office of Douglas Avery. Douglas had handled the Hensley family's legal affairs for nearly 25 years. He looked up from behind his desk and smiled. "Walter, what can I do for you?" Walter sat down, then explained everything. Margaret's journal, the distance growing between him and the children, the calls that always seemed to involve money, the loneliness, the suspicion that he no longer knew who would come if he had nothing left to offer. Douglas listened without interrupting. When Walter finished, silence filled the office. Finally, the attorney leaned back. "I don't think I'm going to like whatever comes next." "You probably won't." Walter outlined his plan. Every farm account would be transferred into a protected trust. The investments would disappear from public view. The grain contracts would be managed through Douglas's office. Gerald Mercer would oversee daily operations. And Walter would move out of the farmhouse. Douglas stared at him. "You're serious?" "I am." "You want your children to believe you've lost everything?" "Yes." The attorney rubbed his forehead. "This is a terrible idea." "Probably. They'll be furious when they find out." Walter looked toward the window. "If none of them come when I'm broke, their anger won't matter." 3 days later, Walter shared the plan with Gerald Mercer. The old rancher listened quietly. When Walter finished, Gerald shook his head. "Margaret would absolutely hate this." Walter laughed for the first time in weeks. "You're probably right. She'd call it dramatic." "She's probably right about that, too." Despite his objections, Gerald agreed to help. By August, the arrangements were complete. The farm continued operating, but only a handful of people knew the truth. On September 1st, Walter loaded a few belongings into the back of a pickup truck. Margaret's photograph, her journal, several changes of clothes, a coffee maker, and a small folding chair. Then he locked the farmhouse door. For the first time in nearly 50 years, he walked away from the home he had built with Margaret. The old worker's trailer sat near the northern edge of the property, weathered, narrow, lonely. Walter stepped inside. The test had begun. That evening, he picked up his phone and called his children one by one. The trailer felt smaller after sunset. Wind rattled the thin aluminum siding, and the single overhead light cast long shadows across the narrow kitchen. Walter sat alone at the small fold-out table. Margaret's photograph stood beside his coffee cup. For several minutes, he stared at it. Then he picked up his phone. Travis answered first. The sound of office chatter filled the background. His oldest son was still working. That didn't surprise Walter. Work had always come first for Travis. "Dad?" Walter took a slow breath and began telling the story he and Douglas had rehearsed. Bad investments, falling grain prices, debt, missed payments, foreclosure. The farm was gone. The investments were gone. Everything was gone. When he finished speaking, silence lingered on the line. Finally, Travis spoke. "How did this happen?" Walter had expected anger. Instead, he heard disbelief. "I made mistakes. You should have called me sooner." "I know." Another pause. Then came the question. "Is there any equity left in the land?" Walter closed his eyes. "No." Travis exhaled sharply. "I need time to think about this." The call ended 3 minutes later. Walter stared at the phone before placing it face down on the table. Next came Vanessa. She answered immediately. Her voice carried the familiar pace of someone moving through a busy schedule. Walter repeated the story. When he finished, Vanessa sounded genuinely shocked. "Oh, Dad. I'm sorry." The sympathy comforted him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she asked, "So what are you going to do now?" Walter looked around the trailer. "I don't know yet. Maybe there are retirement communities that can help. Maybe. We'll figure something out." But she didn't offer to come. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Walter thanked her and hung up. The third call was the hardest. Ethan answered while machinery roared somewhere in the background. The repair shop. Dad? Walter explained everything. This time the silence felt different, heavier, more personal. What about the money? Ethan finally asked. What money? The money you promised you'd help me with if things got worse. Walter felt a stab of guilt. Ethan's business had struggled for nearly a year. There isn't any money left. The line went quiet. Then Ethan spoke again. Only now his voice sounded frightened, not angry, afraid. I was counting on that. Walter swallowed. I'm sorry. A few seconds later, the call disconnected. For a long time, Walter stared at the dark screen. Of all the reactions, Ethan's bothered him the most, because beneath the disappointment, he had heard desperation. The kind of desperation a father never wants to hear in his son's voice. Finally, he dialed Claire. She answered on the second ring. Hi, Dad. The warmth in her voice immediately reminded him of Margaret. For a moment, he nearly abandoned the entire plan. Then he forced himself to continue. Patiently, he told the story one final time. The lost farm, the debt, the trailer, the bankruptcy. Claire listened without interrupting. Not once. When Walter finished, silence filled the line. But unlike the others, her silence felt thoughtful rather than calculating. Then she asked a single question. Are you safe? Walter blinked. What? Are you safe, Dad? The question caught him completely off guard. Yes. Do you have food? Enough. Are you taking your medication? Walter almost laughed. Yes. Good. Another brief pause. Then Claire said something none of the others had. I'm coming Saturday. You don't have to. I'm not asking. The firmness in her voice sounded remarkably like Margaret. Walter felt an unexpected lump rise in his throat. It's a long drive. I know. You have work. I know. You have the kids. I know. Claire's tone softened. You're my father. Nothing else needed to be said. After they hung up, Walter sat alone in the trailer. Outside, darkness settled across the fields. Inside, the silence seemed different now. Not quite as empty. He reached into a kitchen drawer and removed a small notebook he had purchased earlier that afternoon. A cheap notebook. Nothing special. He opened to the first page, then carefully wrote 4 names. Travis, Vanessa, Ethan, Claire. Beside each name, he recorded their reactions. When he reached Claire's section, he paused. Then he wrote, First question. Are you safe? Walter closed the notebook. For the first time since moving into the trailer, he wondered whether the test might already be revealing answers he wasn't prepared to face. And on Saturday morning, the first visitor would arrive. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air. Walter woke before sunrise. For several minutes, he lay on the narrow trailer bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds around him. The farmhouse had always creaked in certain places. The trailer rattled. The farmhouse felt permanent. The trailer felt borrowed, temporary, like a place nobody intended to stay. He made coffee and sat outside on the metal steps. The wheat field stretched toward the horizon, glowing gold beneath the rising sun. For a moment, he almost forgot the test. Then he heard tires on gravel. Claire's station wagon appeared at the end of the drive. Walter checked his watch. 9:02 a.m. Exactly when she said she would arrive. The vehicle stopped beside the trailer. Before Walter could stand, the rear door flew open. 9-year-old Sadie jumped out first. 7-year-old Noah followed seconds later. Grandpa! The children raced toward him. Walter barely had time to open his arms before they crashed into him. For the first time in months, he laughed. A real laugh. Not the polite kind he gave neighbors. The kind that came from somewhere deeper. Claire climbed out carrying reusable grocery bags. Behind her came Owen, who immediately noticed the trailer's sagging front step. That looks dangerous, he said. Walter smiled. Good morning to you, too. Owen grinned. Just being honest, within minutes, the trailer felt completely different. The children explored every corner. Claire filled the refrigerator. Owen inspected loose hinges and a leaking faucet. Nobody mentioned the farm. Nobody mentioned money. Nobody asked about inheritance. Around noon, Claire sat across from Walter at the small table. She poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. Tell me what happened. Walter repeated the story. The bankruptcy, the debt, the losses, the foreclosure. Claire listened quietly. When he finished, she asked only one question. What do you need? Walter looked at her. Not, what did you lose? Not how much is left? Not whose fault was it? What do you need? The difference mattered. That evening, after they left, Walter opened his notebook. Under Claire's name, he added nearly half a page. Brought groceries, fixed the faucet, asked what I needed, stayed 6 hours. Children hugged me. No mention of money. He stared at the words for a long time before closing the notebook. The following week, another visitor arrived. Travis. His sedan looked almost out of place on the gravel road. Clean, polished, expensive. Walter watched him step from the car. His oldest son stood for several seconds, studying the trailer. Not judging, evaluating, assessing, the same way he approached business deals. Inside, Travis looked around slowly. This is where you're living? For now. Walter repeated the story again. When he finished, Travis folded his arms. You should have diversified sooner. Walter remained silent. There had to be warning signs. There were. You should have called me. The words sounded caring, but they were followed immediately by another question. What happens to the remaining acreage? Walter felt disappointment settle quietly inside him. Not because Travis was cruel. Because he genuinely believed he was helping. He simply viewed every problem through numbers. The visit lasted 90 minutes. When Travis left, Walter opened the notebook again. Assessed property. Discussed land value. Suggested restructuring. Did not ask if I was lonely. 3 weeks later, Vanessa called. Twice. Both conversations lasted less than 10 minutes. She promised to visit. She never did. By October, a pattern had begun emerging. Claire came every Saturday, without fail. The others appeared only occasionally, and each week, as Walter filled another page in the notebook, an uncomfortable thought began growing inside him. Maybe the test wasn't revealing who his children were. Maybe it was revealing who they had become. And maybe, somehow, he had helped shape every one of them. November arrived with cold rain and shorter days. The wheat fields turned dull brown beneath gray skies, and the wind that swept across western Kansas carried the promise of winter. Walter had spent nearly 3 months in the trailer, long enough to learn its weaknesses. The furnace worked when it felt like it. The windows leaked cold air. The plumbing groaned every morning. The roof rattled during storms. Every inconvenience reminded him that he didn't belong there. Yet every Saturday, Claire came, without exception. Sometimes she arrived carrying groceries. Sometimes she brought soup she had made the night before. Sometimes she arrived with tools borrowed from Owen's garage. She repaired things the way Margaret once had. Not because anyone asked, but because she noticed what needed attention. One Saturday, she appeared carrying folded blue fabric beneath her arm. What is that? Walter asked. Curtains. The trailer already has curtains. Claire glanced toward the faded plastic blinds hanging crookedly in the window. No, it doesn't. 2 hours later, handmade blue curtains covered the windows. The trailer immediately felt warmer, more human, more lived in. Walter found himself staring at them after Claire left. Margaret used to do things like that. Small improvements, nobody requested. Changes that somehow transformed an entire room. That evening, he wrote another page in the notebook. Hung curtains. Brought groceries. Fixed kitchen cabinet. Stayed 7 hours. Asked if I was eating enough. Again, nothing about money. The notebook was becoming thicker. Claire's section now filled multiple pages. The others occupied only a handful. Travis called twice during November. Both conversations involved business. The first concerned mineral rights. The second involved potential agricultural investors purchasing nearby properties. Walter listened patiently. Neither conversation lasted more than 10 minutes. Neither included a question about his health. Vanessa called once. She apologized for missing another planned visit. Work was overwhelming. A new campaign. New clients. Deadlines. Walter believed her. That didn't make the absence hurt less. Ethan disappeared almost completely. Weeks passed without contact. At first, Walter felt angry, then worried. Finally, just before Thanksgiving, he received an unexpected phone call. It wasn't Ethan. It was Rebecca, Ethan's wife. Her voice sounded exhausted. Walter? Rebecca? I wasn't sure if I should call. Concern immediately tightened in Walter's chest. What happened? A long pause followed. The shop is struggling. Walter closed his eyes. He had suspected as much. How bad? Worse than Ethan admits. She hesitated. He works 14-hour days and still can't catch up. Walter said nothing. Rebecca's next words broke his heart. He feels like he's failing everyone. After the call ended, Walter sat alone in the trailer for nearly an hour. For the first time, he wondered whether Ethan's distance came from selfishness or shame. There was a difference, a significant one. The following week, Gerald Mercer stopped by carrying a thermos of coffee. The old rancher settled into a chair and studied Walter carefully. "You look tired." "I am tired." Gerald nodded. "You got your answer yet?" Walter stared out the window. "I'm still figuring that out." "No, you're not." "What does that mean?" Gerald leaned forward. "It means you've already seen who keeps showing up." Walter remained silent. "Claire drives hours every week." "She does." "Then what's left to learn?" Walter looked down at the notebook lying on the table. The pages seemed heavier than they should. "I don't know." Gerald followed his gaze, then asked the question Walter least wanted to hear. "Are you testing your children, or are you punishing them?" The trailer suddenly felt very quiet. Walter didn't answer, because for the first time, he wasn't sure. That night, after Gerald left, Walter opened Margaret's journal again. He found another entry. Short, simple, written years earlier. "Love isn't proven when life is easy. It's revealed when showing up becomes inconvenient." Walter read the sentence 3 times. Then he looked at the notebook. Claire's pages, Travis's pages, Vanessa's pages, Ethan's pages. Outside, snow began falling for the first time that winter. Inside, Walter felt a growing unease, because Margaret's journal seemed to be asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. And before winter ended, those questions would become impossible to ignore. The first warning came on a bitter January morning when Walter woke with a deep cough and a fever he couldn't shake. At first, Walter convinced himself it was only a winter cold, a scratchy throat, a mild cough. Nothing more. He had spent his entire life working through discomfort. Farmers didn't stop because they felt sick. They kept going. That attitude had carried him through droughts, broken machinery, financial crises, and countless Kansas winters. But this time was different. 3 days after the cough began, Walter woke before dawn, struggling to catch his breath. His chest felt heavy. Every inhale burned. Even walking from the bed to the kitchen left him exhausted. The trailer seemed colder than usual. The walls thinner. The silence heavier. Still, he told himself it would pass. By Sunday evening, his voice had become rough and strained. At exactly 6 o'clock, the phone rang. "Claire," like every Sunday. Walter answered. "Hi, Dad." "Hi." The single word was enough. Claire immediately noticed. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." "Dad, it's just a cold." "How long?" Walter hesitated. "Few days." The silence on the other end told him she didn't believe him. "Have you seen a doctor?" "No." Another pause. Then came the voice he remembered hearing from Margaret whenever stubbornness crossed into foolishness. "I'm coming tomorrow. You don't need to." "I'm coming." The call ended. Walter knew better than to argue. The next morning, Claire arrived before 8. Snow covered the fields. The sky hung low and gray above the property. Walter opened the trailer door. Claire took one look at him and frowned. "You look terrible." "Good morning to you, too." "I'm serious." She stepped closer and placed a hand against his forehead. The expression on her face immediately changed. "We're going to town." "No." "Yes." "I'm fine." "No, you're not." An hour later, they sat in a clinic examination room. The doctor listened to Walter's lungs, reviewed his symptoms, and ordered a chest x-ray. The diagnosis came quickly. Pneumonia. Walter wasn't surprised. Claire wasn't either. The doctor recommended hospitalization. Walter refused. The discussion that followed lasted nearly 10 minutes. By the end, a compromise emerged. Walter could recover at the trailer, but only if someone stayed with him. Walter expected Claire to drive home and arrange something. Instead, she pulled out her phone. "I'm taking the week off." "What?" She ignored him. She called the school, requested emergency leave, then called Owen. "I'm staying with Dad for a few days." Walter protested all the way back to the farm. Claire ignored every word. For 4 days, she lived in the trailer. She cooked soup, organized medications, checked his temperature, woke up during the night whenever his coughing worsened. On the second day, Owen arrived carrying insulation panels in the back of his truck. Without being asked, he crawled beneath the trailer and sealed every gap where cold air entered. Noah and Sadie came with him. They taped drawings to the refrigerator. Bright colors filled the tiny kitchen. For the first time since moving there, the trailer felt less like a hiding place, more like a home. Late on the third night, Walter's fever finally broke. He woke sometime after midnight. The trailer was quiet. Claire sat at the table grading papers beneath a small lamp. The scene reminded him so much of Margaret that it almost hurt. For several minutes, he simply watched. Then, he spoke. "Thank you." Claire looked up. "For what?" "For staying." She smiled softly. "You're my father." Nothing more, nothing less. The simplicity of it left him speechless. The following morning, while Claire was in the shower, Walter's phone rang. "Travis." Walter answered. His son launched directly into a discussion about agricultural investors purchasing farmland nearby. A potential opportunity. Strong offers. Good timing. Several minutes passed before Travis finally noticed the weakness in Walter's voice. "Are you sick?" "Pneumonia." Silence. Then, "Oh." A pause followed. "Are you getting treatment?" "Claire's here, helping." "Good." Another pause. Then Travis continued discussing land values. When the call ended, Walter stared at the phone for a long time. That evening, he opened the notebook. Under Travis's name, he wrote, "Learned about pneumonia during conversation. Did not offer to visit." Then he opened Margaret's journal. The entry he found was dated 6 years earlier. The words struck harder than anything he had read before. Walter loves the children deeply, but he assumes they know it. Love left unspoken becomes invisible. One day he'll understand that. I just hope it isn't too late. Walter closed the journal. The trailer was silent except for the sound of Claire washing dishes in the next room. For months, he had been testing his children. Now, for the first time, he began realizing something far more painful. Margaret had been testing him all along, and unlike his children, he wasn't sure he was passing. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Kansas. By late February, patches of brown earth began appearing beneath the melting snow. The wind remained cold, but there were occasional afternoons when sunlight lingered long enough to hint at spring. Walter recovered from the pneumonia, physically, at least. The deeper illness, the questions Margaret's journal had planted in his mind, remained. Every evening, he sat at the small trailer table with the notebook in one hand and Margaret's journal in the other. For months, he had focused on what his children were doing. Now he began focusing on why. The answers weren't comfortable. One night, he turned to a journal entry written nearly 10 years earlier. Walter read slowly. Travis wants his father's approval more than money, but Walter doesn't see it. Every time Travis succeeds, Walter talks about numbers instead of effort. Walter closed his eyes. Immediately, memories surfaced. Business milestones, awards, expansions, achievements. How many times had he congratulated Travis by discussing profits instead of pride? Too many. Another entry waited. A few pages later. Vanessa works herself to exhaustion because she believes worth is earned through achievement. I wonder where she learned that. Walter didn't need to wonder. She learned it from him. His entire life had revolved around work, planting, harvesting, expanding, building. Vanessa had simply copied the example he provided. Then came Ethan. The entry that followed struck hardest. Ethan always asks for help when things are already falling apart. He doesn't know how to ask for comfort because nobody ever taught him the difference. Walter sat motionless for several minutes. Ethan's entire adult life suddenly made more sense. Every conversation had revolved around money, because money was the only language Walter had consistently spoken. And Claire? Margaret's final observation nearly broke him. Claire learned love from watching, not listening. She watched kindness. She watched patience. She watched presence. Thank God someone did. Walter carefully closed the journal. For the first time, he understood something Margaret had been trying to tell him for years. His children weren't strangers. They were reflections, some clearer than others, some carrying qualities he admired, others carrying mistakes he regretted. But all of them, in one way or another, had been shaped by him. The realization changed everything. March arrived, then April. The trailer remained his home. Claire continued showing up every Saturday, without fail. Meanwhile, Ethan's situation worsened. Walter learned the details through an unexpected source. Rebecca. She called one evening after Claire returned from visiting them. The shop closed. Walter felt his stomach tighten. When? Last week. The words sounded exhausted, defeated. He tried everything. Walter looked out the trailer window toward the distant farmhouse. A farmhouse containing millions of dollars in hidden assets. Money Ethan desperately needed. Money Walter was deliberately withholding. For the first time since beginning the test, shame crept into his chest. Not because the test was revealing something ugly about Ethan, because it was revealing something ugly about himself. Several days later, Claire drove to visit Ethan's family. She brought groceries, a casserole, school supplies for Caleb. When she returned that evening, Walter asked how the visit had gone. Claire sighed. He told me to leave. Walter wasn't surprised. Pride, shame. Claire corrected softly. The distinction mattered. Walter thought about that conversation for days. Then, one warm evening near the end of May, he sat outside the trailer, watching sunset spill across the fields. The wheat moved gently in the breeze. The same fields he had spent decades cultivating, the same fields he had pretended to lose. Claire sat beside him. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, she said, "Mom would have hated this trailer." Walter laughed. Yes, she would have. She would have dragged you back into the farmhouse months ago. The laughter faded. Walter stared across the property, toward the house, toward the life he had abandoned, toward the family he was finally beginning to understand. And suddenly, he knew. The test had gone on long enough. He stood up. Claire looked at him. What is it? Walter took a deep breath. It's time. Time for what? He looked toward the farmhouse one last time. Time to tell the truth. That night, after Claire left, Walter picked up his phone and dialed Douglas Avery. The attorney answered on the third ring. Walter, it's over. A pause. Then, you've made a decision? Yes. Walter glanced at the notebook resting beside Margaret's journal. 9 months of observations, 9 months of mistakes, 9 months of lessons. Set up a family meeting, he said quietly. I want all 4 of my children here next Saturday. Because for the first time since Margaret died, Walter was ready to stop testing his family and start facing it. Saturday arrived bright and warm. The Kansas sky stretched endlessly above Hensley Ridge Farm, clear and blue, as though the weather itself had decided to stay out of the family's business. Walter woke before sunrise. For the first time in 9 months, he shaved carefully, pressed a clean shirt, polished his boots. Then he walked out of the trailer and looked toward the farmhouse. The house stood exactly where it always had, waiting. Gerald had spent the previous 2 days airing it out, opening windows, dusting furniture, and making sure everything looked lived in again. The sight of it tightened something inside Walter's chest. By 10 o'clock, all 4 children had arrived. Claire came first, as always. Then Travis. Then Vanessa. Ethan arrived last. His truck looked older than Walter remembered. So did Ethan. The 5 of them gathered in the farmhouse kitchen, the same kitchen where birthdays had been celebrated. Homework had been completed. Arguments had been settled. The same kitchen where Margaret had spent nearly 50 years holding everyone together. Now, only silence filled the room. Walter stood at the head of the table. The notebook rested beside him. A stack of financial documents sat nearby. Proof, evidence, the truth. Finally, he spoke. The farm never went bankrupt. Nobody moved. For several seconds, the words seemed unable to settle. Then Travis blinked. What? Walter took a breath. I lied. The room exploded. You lied? Travis demanded. All of it? The debt, the foreclosure, the bankruptcy. Walter nodded. It wasn't real. Vanessa stared at him. Her face had gone pale. Ethan looked confused. Claire remained silent. She simply watched. Walter opened the financial reports. The farm is profitable. He pushed the papers forward. The investments are intact. More silence. Then anger. Real anger. You made us believe you lost everything, Travis said. You let us think you were living in poverty. I was. No, you weren't. Walter nodded slowly. You're right. The distinction hurt because it was true. He hadn't been poor. He had only pretended to be. Ethan suddenly stood. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. You had money? Walter looked at his son. Yes. The word barely left his mouth before Ethan laughed. It wasn't humor. It was pain. My business failed. The room fell silent. Ethan's eyes filled. "You knew I was drowning." Walter lowered his gaze. "Yes." "You watched it happen." The accusation landed with brutal accuracy, because it was true. Walter had watched. Not because he didn't care, because he believed he was searching for truth. Now he wasn't entirely sure. Before anyone else could speak, Claire finally stood. Enough. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room quieted immediately. She looked at Ethan first, then Travis, then Vanessa. "Finally, Walter. Nobody's innocent here." The words hung in the air. Walter recognized Margaret's influence instantly. Claire continued. "We all failed after Mom died." Travis crossed his arms. "That's not the same thing." "No?" Claire turned toward him. "When was the last time you visited before Dad moved into the trailer?" Travis said nothing. Claire looked at Vanessa. "When was the last time you called without multitasking?" Vanessa lowered her eyes. Then, Ethan. "When was the last time you asked Dad for something that wasn't money?" Ethan didn't answer. Finally, she faced Walter. "And when was the last time you told any of them you were proud of them?" Silence. The deepest silence yet, because no one had an answer. Walter felt Margaret's journal pressing against his conscience. Every page, every warning, every lesson. For months he had believed he was testing his children. Now he finally understood. The test had revealed something larger. Not one broken relationship, an entire broken family. And everyone sitting around the table had helped break it. Walter looked at his children, really looked at them. Not as business owners, not as adults, not as disappointments, as people, his people. Then, for the first time in decades, he said the words he should have spoken years earlier. "I'm sorry." Nobody interrupted. "I thought providing for you was enough." His voice trembled. It wasn't. He looked directly at Travis. "I was proud of you." Then Vanessa. "I should have called more." Then Ethan. "I should have listened more." Finally, Claire. "I should have thanked you sooner." Tears filled Vanessa's eyes. Ethan sat down heavily. Travis stared out the window. The anger remained. The hurt remained. But something else appeared beside them. Honesty. For the first time since Margaret died, nobody was pretending. Not Walter. Not the children. Not anyone. The silence that followed felt different. Not empty. Not hostile. Simply honest. Outside, somewhere beyond the kitchen window, children laughed in the distance. Inside, 5 members of the same family sat together in the truth. And for the first time in nearly a year, healing finally had somewhere to begin. The family meeting ended without dramatic speeches. No one suddenly forgot the hurt. No one walked away completely healed. Real life didn't work that way. But something important had changed. The walls that had quietly risen between them over the years finally had cracks in them. And through those cracks, light was beginning to enter. The next morning, Walter moved back into the farmhouse. Gerald helped him carry the few belongings he had accumulated during his months in the trailer. Margaret's photograph, her journal, the notebook, the blue curtains Claire had sewn. When Walter locked the trailer door for the last time, he stood there for a moment. The old structure looked exactly the same, yet he was different. He had entered it believing he was testing his children. He left it, understanding himself. A week later, Douglas Avery arrived with a stack of legal documents. The attorney spread them across the dining room table. Walter reviewed every page carefully. The decisions had taken months, but now they felt right. The farm would remain intact. Hensley Ridge Farm would become a family trust. Claire would serve as its primary steward, not because she had won anything, not because Walter loved her more, but because she had demonstrated something the farm required: commitment, responsibility, presence. The trust would ultimately benefit every grandchild: Sadie, Noah, Caleb, Travis's children, any future grandchildren yet to come. The land would belong to the family, not an individual. The investment portfolio would be divided equally among Travis, Vanessa, and Ethan. No penalties, no rewards, no punishments. Gerald had convinced Walter of that. "Don't spend the rest of your life grading your children," he had said. Walter finally listened. There was one final addition, a handwritten note attached to the trust documents. Simple, short, personal. Sunday dinner. First Sunday of every month. Come because you want to. The table is big enough. Douglas smiled when he read it. Margaret would have approved. July arrived. The first Sunday dinner came with it. Claire organized everything. Of course she did. The farmhouse filled with familiar smells. Roast beef, fresh bread, mashed potatoes, recipes Margaret had cooked for decades. Ethan arrived first. He looked different, lighter somehow. A few weeks earlier, he had accepted a position helping Gerald manage part of the cattle operation while learning the grain business. For the first time in months, hope had returned to his eyes. "Need any help?" he asked. Claire handed him a knife and a pile of vegetables. He got to work immediately. Vanessa arrived next, carrying a pie she openly admitted she hadn't baked herself. The honesty made everyone laugh. Then came Travis. His wife and children followed him through the front door. For several seconds, he simply stood in the entryway looking around. The house contained memories in every corner, some joyful, some painful. Eventually, Walter stepped forward. Without speaking, he extended his hand. Travis took it. The handshake lingered. Then both men smiled. Dinner was crowded. Children laughed. Conversations overlapped. Plates clattered. Nobody discussed trusts. Nobody discussed inheritances. Nobody discussed money. Instead, they talked about school, work, gardens, sports, ordinary things. The kind of things families should have been discussing all along. Later that evening, after everyone had eaten, Walter brought a small wooden box onto the porch. He handed it to Claire. She opened it slowly. Inside sat Margaret's recipe cards, hundreds of them. Years of family meals written in Margaret's careful handwriting. Claire's eyes filled immediately. Near the bottom, she discovered a sealed envelope. Her name was written across the front. She looked at Walter. "I didn't put it there." Claire opened the letter and quietly read. When she finished, she folded it carefully, pressed it against her chest, then smiled through tears. "What did she say?" Walter asked. Claire shook her head gently. "Something just for me." Walter nodded. That seemed exactly like Margaret. The evening slowly settled into night. One by one, vehicles left the driveway. Eventually, only Walter remained on the porch. The wheat fields stretched into darkness. The grain silos stood tall against the fading sky. For years, he had believed those things were his legacy. The farm, the land, the buildings, the wealth. Now he knew better. Inside the house, he heard laughter. Noah arguing with Sadie. Claire talking with Owen. The familiar sounds of people who belonged together. Walter touched the wedding ring hanging from a chain around his neck. "You were right," he whispered toward the darkness. As usual, Margaret remained undefeated. A moment later, the screen door opened. 7-year-old Noah stepped onto the porch. "Grandpa?" Walter turned. "We're waiting for you." For a moment, he looked back across the fields. Everything he had spent a lifetime building stood before him. But the most important part wasn't outside. It was inside, waiting, smiling, alive. Walter rose from his chair. Then, without looking back again, he walked into the warmth of the farmhouse, into the light, into the family he almost lost. And finally, after a year of grief, mistakes, forgiveness, and second chances, Walter Hensley came home.